Welcome to the core of behavior analysis, understanding how consequences shape behavior. This topic, positive and negative reinforcement contingencies, is a foundational pillar of the BCBA exam, directly tied to Task B.4. We will explore the precise definitions of positive and negative reinforcement, breaking down how each adds or removes a stimulus to increase a behavior. You'll master the three-term contingency of antecedent, behavior, and consequence, and learn the four critical features that define any reinforcement contingency. We'll compare these two processes side by side, examine real-world examples of positive reinforcement in action, and clear up common misconceptions, like the myth that negative means punishment. This isn't just vocabulary, it's the engine driving behavior change. Expect to see multiple exam questions testing your ability to identify and distinguish these contingencies, so building a rock-solid understanding here will pay dividends across every other domain. On this slide, we are drawing the critical distinction between positive and negative reinforcement, both of which increase the future frequency of a behavior, but through opposite operations. Positive reinforcement occurs when a response is followed by the addition of a stimulus, such as a child receiving praise after completing a chore, which makes that chore more likely in similar future conditions. Negative reinforcement, in contrast, involves the removal of an aversive stimulus following a response, like turning off a loud alarm by buckling a seatbelt, which also increases the behavior. The key exam point is that both contingencies strengthen behavior. The difference lies solely in whether a stimulus is added or taken away. You must also remember the contingency requirement. The consequence must be temporally and causally linked to the behavior. Without that clear relation, reinforcement is not established. On the BCBA exam, you will often be given a scenario and asked to identify whether a stimulus is being added or removed to increase behavior. So practice parsing each example for that operation rather than focusing on labels like reward or escape. To master the BCBA exam, you must understand that reinforcement is never a standalone event. It is a three-term contingency or operant conditioning unit that the BCB task list B.4 asks you to distinguish for both positive and negative reinforcement. The antecedent or discriminative stimulus, SD, signals that a specific response will now produce a reinforcer. For example, a teacher's instruction, "Show me the ball," sets the occasion for the child to point or say ball. This SD must be present for the contingency to be effective. The behavior itself must be an operant, voluntarily emitted by the learner, not reflexively elicited, and it is the action that directly produces the reinforcing consequence. The consequence is where positive and negative reinforcement diverge. Positive reinforcement adds a stimulus like praise or a token, while negative reinforcement removes an aversive stimulus, such as ending a demand or turning off noise. Critically, the consequence must follow the behavior immediately and functionally increase the behavior's future probability under similar antecedent conditions. On the exam, expect scenario-based questions asking you to identify which element of the three-term contingency is missing or misapplied, so practice breaking down real-world examples into SD, response, and reinforcer. When you're analyzing reinforcement contingencies for the BCBA exam, remember that it's not just about adding or removing something. It's about the precise conditions that make that consequence functional. This slide highlights four critical features you must evaluate in every contingency. Immediacy means the reinforcer must follow the behavior within seconds to create a clear cause and effect link. Delays weaken the learning. Contingency is non-negotiable. Reinforcement only occurs when the target behavior happens, which is what makes the response strengthen. Magnitude matters because a larger or more preferred reinforcer often produces a stronger effect, but you must watch for satiation and ethical limits. Finally, motivating operations like deprivation or satiation directly alter how effective a reinforcer is at that moment. On the exam, you'll need to identify when a contingency is weak because one of these features is missing or misapplied, so practice spotting each element in applied scenarios. This slide clarifies the critical distinction between positive and negative reinforcement contingencies, both of which increase the future frequency of behavior. Positive reinforcement involves adding a stimulus, like praise, a token, or a preferred activity, immediately after a behavior, as when a child completes chores and receives a cookie. Negative reinforcement involves removing an aversive stimulus, such as terminating a demand or eliminating a loud noise, contingent on a behavior. For example, John uses a no-picture exchange card and the teacher removes a disliked toy. A common exam trap is confusing positive reinforcement with bribery, but reinforcement is always contingent on the behavior, not offered beforehand. Similarly, negative reinforcement is often mistaken for punishment because both involve removal, but remember, reinforcement always increases behavior, while punishment decreases it. On the BCBA exam, you must identify which contingency is operating based on whether a stimulus is added or removed and confirm the behavior's rate increases. Mastery of this comparison is foundational for designing effective behavior change programs and avoiding common confusions that appear in multiple-choice questions. On this slide, we're examining real-world applications of positive reinforcement contingencies, a core component of Task B.4 on the BCBA exam. In each example, a behavior is followed by the addition of a stimulus, a sticker, praise, a bonus, social media access, or an edible that increases the future frequency of that behavior. For the exam, you must recognize that positive reinforcement is defined by the effect on behavior, not by the pleasantness of the consequence. A sticker only functions as a reinforcer if hand-raising increases. If it doesn't, it's not reinforcement. Notice how the contingency is explicit. The reinforcer is delivered immediately after the target response, strengthening the behavior-environment relation. In the therapy example, the edible is contingent on correct vocal imitation, not on all attempts, which sharpens stimulus control. As a test taker, be prepared to identify whether a described scenario meets the three-term contingency of antecedent, behavior, and consequence, and to distinguish positive reinforcement from other procedures like bribery or reward systems that lack contingency. A common pitfall on the BCBA exam is confusing reinforcement with punishment or bribery. Remember, both positive and negative reinforcement increase behavior. The key difference is whether a stimulus is added or removed. Bribery is offered before a behavior occurs, whereas reinforcement is delivered contingently after the behavior, making it a consequence, not an antecedent. It's also a misconception that reinforcers must be pleasant or that reinforcement only applies to appropriate behavior. In practice, a client may find a particular edible reinforcing even if it's not universally pleasant. An escape-maintained problem behavior is a classic example of negative reinforcement in action. Finally, reinforcement does not require the learner's awareness. It can shape behavior automatically. On the exam, you'll need to identify these contingencies in scenarios, so focus on the function. Does the behavior increase because something is added or removed? That distinction is the core of Task B.4. Establishing a reinforcement contingency is a systematic process that begins with identifying the target behavior in observable, measurable terms. This ensures you can reliably detect its occurrence and deliver the consequence precisely when it happens. Next, you select a reinforcer, which requires using preference assessments or direct observation to choose a stimulus likely to function as a reinforcer for that individual, recognizing that reinforcer effectiveness is individualized. The critical step is delivering that consequence contingently, immediately after the behavior, whether you are adding a stimulus in positive reinforcement or removing one in negative reinforcement, because the temporal relation is what strengthens the behavior. Finally, you must monitor and adjust by collecting data on behavior frequency. If the behavior does not increase, you modify the reinforcer type, magnitude, or timing. On the BCBA exam, questions may ask you to identify which step in this process is missing or flawed, such as failing to define the behavior clearly or delivering reinforcement after a delay, which disrupts the contingency. As you study positive and negative reinforcement contingencies for the BCBA exam, it's essential to distinguish the types of reinforcers that can be arranged within those contingencies. Unconditioned reinforcers, like food and water, require no prior learning history and are effective for almost any learner, though they are vulnerable to satiation, a key consideration when designing reinforcement schedules. Conditioned reinforcers, such as verbal praise or tokens, start as neutral stimuli and gain reinforcing power through pairing with existing reinforcers. They're more practical for everyday intervention, but may need periodic pairing to maintain their value. Generalized conditioned reinforcers, like money or tokens, have been paired with many different reinforcers across multiple contexts, making them highly durable and less susceptible to satiation. On the exam, You might be asked to identify which type of reinforcer is being used in a given contingency or to recommend the most appropriate reinforcer for a specific behavior change program. Understanding these distinctions helps you select reinforcers that sustain behavior under both positive and negative reinforcement arrangements. For the BCBA exam, you must understand that the effectiveness of a reinforcement contingency is not automatic. It depends on several key variables. Immediacy is critical. A reinforcer delivered right after the behavior strengthens the contingency far more than a delayed one, especially during initial skill acquisition. Magnitude matters too. Larger or more preferred reinforcers generally produce stronger response increases, but you must balance this with satiation and ethical considerations, such as avoiding deprivation. The schedule of reinforcement shapes behavior differently. Continuous reinforcement is ideal for establishing a new response, while intermittent schedules build resistance to extinction, a key distinction from maintenance programming. Finally, motivating operations alter the current value of a reinforcer. Deprivation enhances effectiveness, while satiation diminishes it. For example, food is only reinforcing when the learner is hungry. On the exam, you may be asked to identify which factor is being manipulated in a scenario. So practice analyzing how these variables interact within a given contingency to predict behavior change. Even when we understand the definition of reinforcement, common implementation errors can sabotage our contingencies. Delayed reinforcement is a frequent pitfall. Waiting too long to deliver the consequence weakens the temporal link between behavior and its effect, potentially reinforcing an intervening response instead of the target. Non-contingent delivery, where reinforcement is provided regardless of behavior, fails to strengthen any specific response and may inadvertently strengthen other behaviors. Using ineffective reinforcers means the stimulus isn't actually reinforcing for that individual, so the behavior won't increase. Satiation reduces reinforcer potency. Rotating stimuli or using varied reinforcers helps maintain their value. Finally, reinforcing the wrong behavior, such as delivering attention following a problem behavior, can strengthen maladaptive responses. For the BCBA exam, you must be able to identify these errors and scenarios and explain how they undermine the three-term contingency. Recognizing these mistakes is essential for designing effective reinforcement procedures that truly increase desired behaviors. When preparing for the BCBA exam, it's essential to see how positive and negative reinforcement contingencies play out across real clinical applications, not just in textbook definitions. On this slide, you're walking through 5 common procedures where the same behavioral principle, reinforcement, takes 2 different forms. In skill acquisition, for example, you might reinforce a correct response by adding praise or a token, positive, or by removing a difficult demand after the correct response, negative. In behavior reduction, you reinforce an alternative behavior either by delivering a preferred item or by ending an aversive task. Notice that in token economies, tokens are added for desired behaviors. That's positive reinforcement. But removing tokens is response cost, which is punishment, not negative reinforcement. For functional communication, you reinforce appropriate requests either by adding a preferred item or by removing a non-preferred activity. Finally, in self-management, the client might self-deliver praise or allow a break. On the exam, you'll need to identify which contingency is operating in each scenario. So practice distinguishing the addition versus removal of a stimulus that increases behavior. As you prepare for the B.4 task on the BCBA exam, lock in these foundational truths about reinforcement contingencies. First, both positive and negative reinforcement share one defining feature. They increase the future frequency of the behavior they follow. That is non-negotiable. The critical distinction lies in stimulus change direction. Positive adds a stimulus. Negative removes one. Remember, the contingency is essential. Delivering a reinforcer non-contingently does not establish a reinforcement contingency, which is a common trick on exam questions. Also, do not confuse negative reinforcement with punishment. Both involve removal, but reinforcement always increases behavior, while punishment decreases it. Finally, function over form. A stimulus is only a reinforcer if it actually strengthens behavior for that individual. On the exam, you'll be asked to identify whether a scenario describes positive or negative reinforcement based on the direction of stimulus change and the resulting behavior increase. Master these distinctions, and you will confidently answer any B.4 item. As you wrap up your study of positive and negative reinforcement contingencies for Task B.4, remember that both processes strengthen behavior. Positive reinforcement adds a stimulus following a response, while negative reinforcement removes an aversive stimulus. The three-term contingency, antecedent behavior consequence, is your framework for analyzing every instance. Keep in mind the four key features: contingency, contiguity, motivating operations, and individual effectiveness. Avoid common misconceptions, like confusing negative reinforcement with punishment or assuming a reinforcer works for everyone. When designing interventions, select reinforcers based on data, not assumptions, and watch for factors like immediacy, magnitude, and schedule. Clinical applications range from skill acquisition to behavior reduction, always grounded in the function of the behavior. For the BCBA exam, you must be able to identify and distinguish these contingencies in scenarios and graphs. You've built a solid foundation here. Now apply it with precision. Keep practicing with real-world examples and mock questions. You've got this. Every study session moves you closer to that certification goal. Stay focused, stay curious, and trust your preparation.